Hello, welcome to week 4 of Comp 1, and this week we're going to be talking about researching, we're going to be talking about plagiarism, we're going to be talking about the expository paper, and getting ready for that essay that is due 1 week from tomorrow. So before we get too far into anything, I wanted to let everyone know that if you have not turned in Essay 1, you have until midnight tonight to turn in Essay 1. Also, Journal 6 is due tonight. Journal 7 is due next Tuesday. From your quizzes, your past quiz 2, is already over. The due date on that's passed. I believe it was on the 4th of November. However, your next quiz 3, will be opening up on the 15th, and it will be due by Friday of next week. So keep those due dates in mind. Your discussion board post for chapters 5 and 6 are due this Friday, and discussion board posts for chapters 7 and 8, I believe, are due next Friday. So keep up with your reading in your book. Make sure that you are keeping up with your assignments. Remember, journals, if they're late, you can still turn them in. Discussion board posts, if those are late, you can still turn them in. Essays, you typically will not have extended period of time to turn those in, but I did that for the first essay because I did not get very many essays turned in, but I will still give you a 0 if I do not have those in by tonight at midnight. So I have updated all the grades except for the most recent journal, I believe, that was due on Tuesday, and the essay, of course, because I opened those up to stay open until tonight at midnight. So whatever is in your Moodle, that's your grade. I will be posting midterm grades by Monday of next week. Make sure that if you have not been watching your videos and you have not been doing your assignments, you get caught up quickly because the semester is halfway over after this week. Okay, back to what we're going to be discussing for this week. So our next paper is the expository paper. It is due not tomorrow, but 1 week from tomorrow. So that would be due on the 18th by midnight. You will have until Sunday, that following Sunday at midnight, because I always give extra 48 hours in case you didn't get it turned in on time. But then it will permanently close and you will not be able to turn your essay in after that. So make sure that you are working that writing process. Do your brainstorming, do your outlining, then follow that up with your rough draft. I'm going to schedule us to try to do a rough draft peer review for next Thursday again. So have those rough draft essays, and keep in mind you do not have to have the whole thing completed to be able to participate in rough draft peer review, but I do need those rough draft peer reviews by, let's say, Wednesday at noon next week. So make sure that you have them to me by Wednesday at noon of next week. That way I can get those dispersed back to you guys and you can go through the rough draft peer review, send me your corrections or revisions, comments on your peers' papers, and then I'll send them back to the original owner. So for this paper, it's an expository paper. If you look under your essay assignments, it's the second essay, and this one is going to be 3 to 4 pages, and keep in mind that you must cite in this one. So please pay attention to the research information, the citing information that we talk about. Make sure that you are staying up to date on the OWL Purdue and that you're using that for both your reference citations and your in-text citations. Keep in mind that you must cite at least one time from your book and you must cite at least one time from an outside article. So your book is going to be the Linda Tirado book that we have called Hand to Mouth. So you must cite at least one time from here. All of your information for your reference list citation will come from your title page. And then you must get one article through the library databases. And what I would like for you to do is try to schedule a time to go to the library on campus at any time this week so that you can have Megan Coates talk to you about how to use the databases that we have on campus here. That is how you will find your article. It must be scholarly, peer-reviewed article from an academic journal, an accredited academic journal. And you will use the library's website and their links to databases to be able to find that information. She can talk you through that and show you that information. I also want to make sure that everyone is aware that being able to research and cite correctly is going to be worth more points in this essay. So keep that in mind. The first worksheet I would like you to look at from your worksheets tab in Moodle for your Comp 1 classroom is I want you to go to your essay PowerPoint. Okay, so when you're clicking through your essay PowerPoint, please make sure that you read each slide. This essay PowerPoint will cover every single thing that I'm looking for in your essays. And I did this PowerPoint to make sure that it's very clear to you guys what exactly I'm looking for in every single portion of your essay, in every single paragraph of your essay. The second thing I want you to look at underneath your worksheets tab is going to be your thesis PowerPoint. The thesis PowerPoint is important if you are struggling with a thesis. If you're not really sure what constitutes as a good thesis and what constitutes as a bad thesis, make sure that you read through every single slide on that as well. And if you have any questions about that, please contact me. After you have went through the essay PowerPoint and the thesis PowerPoint, I want you to scroll up and look at the plagiarism guidelines. So when we click on plagiarism guidelines, that gives you the different categories of plagiarism. And plagiarism is using someone else's work without giving that person the credit that they deserve. So there are different types of plagiarism, different scales in terms of how bad it is. The categories of plagiarism breaks it down into cheating, recycling, patch writing, robo-translating, masking, and miscuing. So cheating is deliberately substituting someone else's work with the intention of passing it off as your own, deliberately using longer passages of writing in your own work without attribution or citation can also count as cheating and may merit severe consequences as well. This is in terms of you did not even try or attempt to show that this was someone else's work, and you took big, huge chunks or the entire document and tried to pass it off as your own. Recycling is the reuse of your own writing in a research and or writing project. In some cases, you may be allowed to quote your previous work or even use your previous work, but the instructor would definitely need to clear it first. So a lot of you may not even realize that you can plagiarize yourself. If you've written a paper for my class and then in another class they're talking about the same thing and saying you need to write a paper, and you turn the same paper in for that class as you turned in for my class, it is considered recycling plagiarism. If you have cleared it with the instructor, then that's a different story, but unless you've cleared it with the instructor, it's considered plagiarism. The third one listed on this is patch writing. Patch writing is when you take a piece of writing that someone else wrote and selectively change words so that you don't have the exact wording, but still mimic and structure the exact meaning of something someone else wrote. This counts as plagiarism because as a scholar, you are supposed to think through concepts and use your own original wording to explain them to your readers. So when you are patch writing, even though you're taking pieces of it, or selectively changing some of the words, that is still considered plagiarism. Robo-translating. This is when working in different languages. It is sometimes tempting to use online tools to translate the writing into a native language or into a language that you're learning. Sometimes it's acceptable, but sometimes the assignment you're doing requires that you write from scratch in the second language, so it's best to check with the instructor to see if it's allowed or not. Masking. To mask your sources means to fail to clearly attribute and cite the sources you're using in your work. While the methods of attribution and citation may shift depending on your field or genre, your readers should always be able to tell when you're using information from other sources. So masking is basically when you've used a source and maybe you just used one sentence out of that source. You're citing a specific section, but you have not gave a clear attribution to who you got that from, and the citation may not be exactly correct. Miscuing. Miscuing your source means your attributions and citations are getting sloppy. It's difficult for the reader to accurately determine where your information originated. Keep in mind that when you are citing material, it goes hand in hand. We've talked about that. They go together. You have your in-text citations and you have your reference list. The in-text citations give specific information. What that is telling the reader is, hey, the information you read right before this in-text citation was not the author's work. It actually came from this person on this page out of this material. But that doesn't tell us where we can find the material. So that's where the reference list comes in. The person's name, last name, is always going to be in the in-text citation, and that's going to match up with what's on the reference list. The first word on the reference list is going to be the last name of the author. So you match those up, and by doing that, you can see on the reference list exactly how you can find that specific book or article or whatever source it is. So it's important that you do both and you do it correctly. Otherwise, you're miscuing or masking, depending on which one it is. And that basically means that even though you tried to cite and tell me that it wasn't your information, you've gotten to the point where I still can't find that information on my own. So that's why it's very important that you do it correctly. And to do it correctly, we have to follow the rules that are on our APA Purdue website. Now, the second part of the plagiarism categories of plagiarism is called plagiarism and academic dishonesty. So this basically shows you how we go about determining whether we're going to, how we're going to punish your plagiarism, okay? And what it shows is a schedule for like a 16-week course, which is twice as long as you guys have. So you have to half everything. So the weeks 1 through 8, think of those as weeks 1 through 4. Weeks 9 through 12, think of those as weeks 4 through 6. And weeks 13 through 16 would be weeks 6 through 8. Okay? So as you can see, cheating is never okay. Recycling and robo-translating also never okay. But patch writing in the first 4 weeks, we understand that that's going to happen. But you see, at the end of the 4 weeks, I'm going through this big long spiel about exactly what can and can't happen with your plagiarism. And I'm also going to go into details in terms of how can we make sure that we're getting credible sources? How do we make sure that we're correctly citing? So by this point, you should start making sure every single time you use something in someone else's work, in your own writing, that you are indicating to the reader that you got that information from somewhere else. So there should be very little patch writing at this point, and moving forward, there should be none. So masking, same thing. The first 4 weeks were more lenient, and then it continues to grow harder. Miscuing, same thing. So I want you guys to, from this point forward, always make sure that you are trying to correctly cite your material and indicate that you got that material for someone else. Otherwise, I will have to give you a 0. And depending on which part we're in and how bad the plagiarism is, will determine on whether you get to try to make that up. So moving on, after we have went over the plagiarism guidelines, the next one I want you to look at is the how to research worksheet. And this how to research worksheet should be the orange one. Make sure you look over those glossary terms. What is a search engine? A program that helps you to find information on the internet by looking up keywords, example Google, Yahoo, or Bing. So these are Google-like. They're not always going to be Google, but a search engine basically will accept keywords and search for those keywords within sources on the internet. Source is where you get your information from. Citing or to cite is telling the reader where you got your information. And plagiarism is getting information from somewhere and not citing it. This leads others to believe that you are claiming someone's work as your own. So make sure that you look over these terms. They will be on quizzes in the future. Evaluating sources. How do we know if we can trust a source? Evaluating it. So how do we evaluate a source and determine whether it's credible or it's not? Well, one, we have to ask ourselves, is it outdated? Meaning, how old is the source? Because if it's too old, then it may have old information that's not current. 2, validity, meaning who's the author and does the author have proper credentials? Are they qualified? And there's 2 ways that we can do that. We can qualify them by education, meaning they have the degrees to prove that they know what they're talking about in that specific subject, and also experience. Do they have enough experience? Maybe if they don't have the education, maybe they've worked in that field for long enough to where they have gained experience. So that would validate an author. But let's say that author has a doctorate degree, but it's not in the subject they're talking about, then they have not been validated because they can only speak and be an expert in the subject that they have that degree in. Third thing, can you verify the information in other sources and is it accurate? And we do that one of 2 ways. We can find scholarly peer-reviewed articles like I am requiring of you for this next essay. That means that not only is it written by an expert, but other experts in that field have all viewed it, looked through it, and agreed that it's correct, or it could be correct. Or we go out and we compare what that author has written with what other experts in the field are saying about it and determine whether what they're saying is valid. Remember that internet sources are not edited and reviewed like print sources. Anybody can put up anything on the internet. Print sources are reviewed and checked for facts multiple times to ensure quality of publication. So there are literally laws that prevent publications from being able to publish work that is completely inaccurate without being told, hey, this is completely inaccurate. So keep in mind that a print source is almost always going to be more credible and valid than one that you just find on the internet. If you just find it on the internet, then that means that they probably did not do their due diligence to check it, and you have to go that extra mile to make sure that it's been checked for validity. So at the bottom of this paper, it's asking citing. APA information, how to cite. So it gives you some in-text citation information here and some reference list information here. And you're welcome to look at this, but keep in mind that the information on here may be out of date. But how do we know that everything's correct? We check the APA Al Purdue website that we can find on our resources tab, and we follow that link. Okay, once you've looked over your how to research worksheet, I want you to pull up that research source sheet. So the research source sheet basically is 2 pages. On the first page, it's asking you different information about your source. And then on the second page, it has a place where you can fill out some information about your source in terms of what it includes in the text. So this is basically kind of like that basic outline that I gave you, but it's for your sources. So feel free to use this so that you can kind of figure out how to cite your sources correctly, and you have all your information right in front of you. Plus you also have a sheet that is for writing down important information you find within that source. The one thing I want to make sure that we're all clear on is in higher education, it is not expected that you are never going to use outside sources. We encourage you to use outside sources, and in some situations, like with this paper in our third essay, it's required that you use sources. What's important is not that you think, oh, I'm just never going to use a source so I won't have to cite. It's important that you know how to use sources correctly, because we actually require and demand and expect for our students to go outside of the classroom and find experts' opinions about the things that we discussed in class to back up and prove the students' own opinions, okay? So it is important that you learn this step. This is literally, I mean, if you were already basically pretty decent at writing, this is literally the step that you're supposed to pass to be able to get to Comp 2. I have to know that you know how to research, and I have to know that you know how to cite that research material appropriately and correctly into your papers, okay? So it's very critical that you get this information. Okay, the next sheet that I want you to look at is the collecting research, summarize, paraphrase, and quote. The reason I included this is sometimes we struggle with how exactly are we going to insert the citation. What am I going to say when I'm putting this information into my paper? So this can help. Also, it breaks down and gives you the definition of 3 important terms that you will see in future quizzes. So 1, it tells you about summarizing, paraphrasing, and quoting, and it gives you a definition. So what are the differences between these? Well, if we quote, then we're using the information word for word from the source. And it can be any number of sentences, but it must include quotation marks. If we paraphrase, we're restating that information into our own words and our own style, okay? So we're not just moving the words around, we're actually literally changing the words into what we would have said, how we would have said it. And with summarizing, we're taking a large chunk of information and we're condensing it. We're making it smaller. So instead of a paragraph, we turn it into a sentence or 2. Or instead of an entire paper or page, we turn it into a small paragraph. So we're condensing all that information. We're not necessarily trying to change the words and style. We're just trying to minimize it to the most important condensed information that you need. It's important to note that whether you're quoting or paraphrasing or summarizing, you still must cite the material in the text and on the reference list. So you may think, okay, well, if it's quoting, I know exactly where I put that in-text citation. It's going to be right after my quote, before the period. But what about if I'm paraphrasing or summarizing? It's the same thing. As soon as you stop paraphrasing or as soon as you stop summarizing, that is where you insert your in-text citation. You right at the end of the sentence before the period, you would put that open parentheses, last name of the author, comma, date of publication, comma, and then P period, the page number. Then in parentheses, and then put your period for that last sentence there. So, and all this, again, don't memorize what I just said about exactly how to do that in-text citation, because what if you don't have an author's last name? What if you don't know the publication date? What if there's more than one page number? What if there's more than one author? So keep in mind there are caveats to each one of these citations, and all of that's covered in APA Al-Purdue in that link that's in your resources tab. So once we're done looking at that, we're going to go back to worksheets, and we're going to look over some information that's going to tell us how exactly we go about writing an expository paper. So the first thing we need to know about an expository paper is an expository paper means to explain, okay? So I'm looking for you to give an explanation, and if you look over the essay guidelines, I have told you guys that I am wanting you to write your essay about poverty. So it says write an expository essay of 3 to 4 pages explaining poverty using your best grammar and APA 7th edition formatting. You will need to use one direct source, hand to mouth, and one indirect source, an article of your choosing from an academic journal. You will need to cite from each source at least one time. So I'm looking for one in-text citation from your book, one in-text citation from your journal. I'm also looking for one reference list citation for your book and one reference list citation for that article out of a journal. So keep that in mind. You will, or I already read that, don't forget to follow the writing process and use Grammarly, okay? So again, we need to know, how do we approach this? Well, let's look back over there at the worksheets, because some of these worksheets are going to explain to you exactly how to write an expository paper. So an expository paper is a paper that combines 2 genres. We have the informative genre and the analysis genre combining to create the expository paper, which is explaining to us about poverty. Keep in mind, poverty is such a broad, huge idea. I don't think you could do it justice to write about it in 3 pages. However, what we need to do is kind of focus in on one aspect of poverty. So we could talk about how poverty affects education, how poverty affects healthcare, how poverty affects appearances and perceptions within our society, how poverty affects literally anything, right? So you need to ask yourself, how am I going to talk about poverty, and what aspect? So to get to that, I would say use those brainstorming tools that we talked about, listing, webbing, free writing, and stasis questions, to get to the answer of exactly what aspect do you want to talk about poverty. And then when it comes to your topics for that paper about that aspect of poverty, do the same brainstorming thing, except for this time, think about poverty. Let's say I'm going to talk about education and poverty. I could say, so what is it about education and poverty, right? I'm going to go through my webbing. When I think of education and poverty, what are some different topics that are related to that? One might be private school versus public school. One might be quality of educators. One might be all the things that kids have to worry about outside of school, right? So like if someone's living in poverty, they may not have breakfast, they may not have dinner, they may only get to eat at school, they may not have a safe place to sleep, they might not have adults helping them get ready in the morning, versus someone who is not living in poverty and may have all those things. So you got to think about, how do I relate all of these back to that topic that I'm talking about within poverty? And those could be your topics for your body paragraphs. So that's something that I often do is, yes, I use the brainstorming methods to brainstorm my initial idea, but then I continue to brainstorm until I get all of my topics for my main idea in the paper. So that's just a little hint on how I would do it if I were you. Now let's move on. So to explain the expository paper, explaining, remember, we're going to use 2 different methods informative genre, and analysis genre. If you look under your worksheets tab in Moodle, you'll notice there's an informative and then an analysis part 1 and analysis part 2. So let's pull up the informative first. The informative, if you're looking at it right there on that very first line, tells us exactly what an informative paper is going to do. Informative genres teach people new knowledge and new skills. So in this paper, you're teaching your reader new knowledge and new skills about poverty and how it relates to this aspect. Okay? I would prefer for you to read all 3 of those paragraphs to yourself off the informative worksheet, but I'm going to move on. Analysis part 1. And if I'm looking at the analysis part 1, the definition of an analysis is, again, right there in those first 2 sentences. An analysis is a document that helps readers to interpret information, and the goal of an analysis is to break down complex information into its components. So let's think of it like this. You have an engine, and you're going to break that engine down into different parts so that you can understand how those parts work together to create the engine. So that's what we're doing with our subject. In an analysis, you're breaking down complex information like poverty into its parts so that the reader can understand how it works together, how everything goes together. So again, I would suggest you read through this analysis chapter, but we're going to stop right there for now, and we're going to move on to analysis part 2. So in analysis part 2, on that page 184, it talks about strategies for an analysis. And what this means is it's basically telling you when you're writing an analysis, this is the approach you want to take. So remember, we have those steps of our writing process, and the first one is pre-writing. This pre-writing tells us Carlos began the whole process by collecting his sources. What that tells us is when we're writing an analysis, the first thing we need to do is go out and gather our sources. Now, this is very important for this paper because you want to go gather your sources so that you have the facts that you can decide what your opinion is from those facts to work with. Does that make sense? So you start by collecting your sources so that you can move on from getting your sources, reading through them, having an idea of some information that you can share with your reader, and then moving on to your main idea, which will be your own, and incorporating all those things you learned in the pre-writing collecting phase. During pre-writing, that's also when you want to brainstorm and start that outline. Then we want to develop a claim. So once we're developing a claim, that is just another way of saying creating your thesis. If you look on the top of page 187, it says your primary focus is on explaining why. Okay, so that's important because we've already talked about that. When you're creating a thesis, the most important thing is for you to explain why in your thesis. And for this specific thesis, what we should be answering is why is that specific aspect of poverty that you've been telling your readers about? Why is that aspect of poverty so important for us to understand as readers, as a society? What is it about how poverty affects that specific aspect that you think is so important for the readers to understand and acknowledge? So that's the question you're going to be answering to create your thesis. After you've created your thesis, or as it says in here, developed a claim, you're going to move on to your drafting. Okay, so we're assuming you've already organized, gotten your outline, so now it's time to rough draft. And there are 3 things that we need to important things we need to remember when we are coming up with our strategy for writing an analysis. When we actually start drafting, the 3 things are: 1, we want to begin with our evidence. Start with those sources, the facts. 2, provide information that your audience is going to need to know before they can get to the analysis. So are there things you're talking about in this paper that your reader may not be familiar with? If so, make sure you inform them about it before you delve into this complex, complicated issue. Make sure the reader is aware of all the terms and things that they need to know to understand your writing. And 3, frame your analysis in terms of popular or critical reception. Popular or critical reception is just a fancy way of saying this is what everybody else and the experts who have published in this field, this is what they're saying about your subject. So in other words, we need to frame our analysis in terms of what they're saying. We don't want to contradict everything everyone's saying, because that would make us seem like we don't know what we're talking about. However, we also don't want to repeat everything they've said, because that seems like we don't have an original idea. So we want to come up with an original idea that is supported by what they're saying. Finally, well, not finally, but next, when we're revising, because we know we have to at least go through and edit twice, right? So revising is the first time we're going to edit. And this is when we've already got a rough draft, but we want to go back through and make sure the big picture ideas are clear. So here are some things that we want to look at. Did we use appropriate terminology? Meaning, if there's a specific term used for something, we want to use that term, and we don't want to just make up words or explain how it works. Use the actual appropriate term. 2, introduce and interpret quotations. This one's an important one because it also goes with citations. We never want to see a citation right at the beginning or the end of a paragraph, because that means you didn't introduce the citation or you did not explain the citation. So anytime we're using sources in our material, we want to make sure we give an introduction to that source, and then we also want to make sure that we explain why that source or that information from the source is so important to understanding our ideas. And then third, we want to make sure we use descriptive language. So when you're writing an analysis, make sure that you're describing things in a very detailed way so that your reader can follow along and understand and they're not lost. Then when we get to the editing, it's important this time that you really focus on the formatting and that you formatted everything correctly, especially those citations and that reference list. So those are the parts of or the worksheets that you need to look through this week. If you're paying attention, there's a lot of them this week, okay? So make sure you go through them once or twice. Make sure you read through them thoroughly. Make sure you question me in an email or call me during office hours or come by during office hours. Also, please, my on-campus students are actually meeting in the library next Tuesday if you want to meet us there at 9:30 in the morning. And we will be meeting with Megan Coates, the librarian, so that she can go over exactly how we find those sources for the article and how you can use the library as a resource for yourself. If you cannot make it to my 9:30 on Tuesday, then try to go in at your own convenience so that you can find that article. That's all I have for you this week. I hope that you are not putting off and procrastinating this paper, because it's going to come up very, very quickly. If I were you, I'd make sure I got my sources looked up immediately, and then I immediately went into brainstorming and outlining, and then make sure that you do that rough draft and try to get that to me by Wednesday at 12 so that we can make sure that you have some feedback on it before you turn it in to me. Have a good day. Bye.